Great. Okay. Chapter 38. Evie. The carriage ride was silent. It seemed the only thing that could stop the track of Evie's mouth was bone-deep tiredness, and her boss looked concerned. He kept subtly glancing at her, careful not to move his head, but Evie saw it anyway. You'll have to drop me off far enough from the house that Lissa doesn't see you, or she'll never let you leave. Her voice was quiet, a rarity. She saw him nod in her peripheral vision. But how will she get more material for her next installment of Tristan and the Lost Princess? I suppose she'll just have to get creative. Evie bumped her leg against his, playfully, hoping he'd bump hers back. He was still for a moment, but his thigh eventually moved towards hers, lightly tapping. Evie smiled and settled into the cushioned seat, staring off to her side at the passing trees, trying not to get nauseous. They were moving at a leisurely pace, the carriage rolling slowly down the dirt road, neither of them in a hurry, it seemed. She leaned her head back, but snapped up immediately when she saw something that made her heart bottom out to her feet. Off in the distance, a lone figure walked through the trees, far away from the path. She squinted when she couldn't make out their face, only to realize there was no way to see their face because they were wearing a mask. The mask with King Benedict's emblem on it. Oh my! Hiking her skirts up, she stood in the carriage, ignoring her boss's questioning look. Sage? But she didn't answer him. Instead, she took a deep breath and jumped out, stumbling off kilter for a moment, but then sticking the landing, and then she ran. Sage! Evie sprinted toward the figure in the woods, holding up her skirts. She heard the furious shouts from the villain behind her and ignored them. The spy would get away. She knew they would, because the masked figure had spotted her before she even left the carriage and had started to run too. But she wouldn't let them get away. She couldn't. She picked up her speed, kicking her heeled boots harder. Closer and closer she came to the running figure until she leaped through the air, slamming into the spy and both of them tumbling to the ground. They rolled, each trying to get the upper hand. The masked figure took a swing, and Evie dodged the small fist, wrestling the figure beneath her as her gaze locked onto her assailant's very familiar eyes. Her lips parted when she realized who it was beneath her, quickly accompanied by horror. She could hear the villain fast approaching behind them, but Evie had reached up before he arrived, yanking the mask from the figure's head. She gasped and scrambled to her feet, fearful she'd empty the contents of her stomach right there. Becky? Her nemesis stared, glasses gone and brown eyes squinting up at her. Evangelina. You're the spy? Evie was still breathing hard from the foot race, but the shakiness in her voice was all betrayal. When she looked up, the villain stood there, staring at them both, looking a little lost. What? Becky said, realization lighting her face as she bolted to her feet. No, of course not. Evie held up the discarded mask, and Becky pulled her glasses from her pocket, placing the large circular frames against her pert nose. How do you explain this? Evie asked. What the deadlands are you doing out here? Becky sighed, rubbing her elbow, which must have gotten hurt in her tumble. That's none of your business. Evie faced her boss, who did not look as surprised by the situation as she did. Why are you not livid? Did you know about this? No, he said without emotion. I didn't, but I think I know what she's doing with it. He looked to Becky, shaking his head in disappointment. I told you not to give stock to the rumors. How could I not even try? One of the interns dropped the mask in my lap, and I thought if they assumed I was part of the guard, and... You thought they'd give you the cure to the mystic illness because you were wearing a mask? The villain asked incredulously. I thought I could, at the very least, sneak into the Gleaming Palace with it. Becky said with more emotion than Evie had ever seen her express. Her own primary emotion was now confusion, along with pinching hope. A cure? There's no such thing, Evie said, thinking of her father. How much easier life would be again if he were well. You're correct, the villain said angrily. But you don't know that, Becky insisted in a plaintive voice. This wasn't a version of her nemesis Evie knew. She sounded desperate and a little sad, and Evie felt a swath of sympathy and almost tenderness. Let me see if I understand this, Evie said, crossing her arms as she finally gained control of her breathing again. You took the mask from one of the interns, thinking you were going to traipse into the Gleaming City and steal a cure that may or may not exist? Evie shook her head, feeling incredulous. Are you believing this? She asked the villain, who looked very much like he was believing every word. She is being truthful, if naive, he said, shaking his head. When the last dregs of shock finally faded, all of Becky's defense finally registered. You know someone with the mystic illness? The bespectacled woman nodded stiffly, her gaze locked on something in the distance, but her chin remained high. One of the interns left the mask on my desk last week. They were afraid to give it to the boss. I had planned to turn it right over to you, sir. Evie was still worried, but the initial adrenaline had worn down, and the tiredness seemed to be settling back in. How do we know you're not lying? The look on Becky's face when she turned to stare at Evie would remain in her memory for the rest of her life. It was one of such pain that Evie began to feel ridiculous for questioning her in the first place, feeling worse still when Becky began to speak. If you knew anything about me, which you do not, you'd know I would rather hang on my own head in the office entryway than ever step foot near the Gleaming Palace, unless I had to. Something told Evie she wouldn't learn those things about her, at least not today. But the villain knew. She could see it in his eyes. Becky tossed the mask over to their boss, who caught it and tucked it into his pocket. I'm sorry, she said in defeat. It was foolish. The villain nodded, looking back toward the abandoned carriage and the startled horses. I need to see them. He looked at Becky with a measure of respect and just a drop of gentleness when he said, If we ever receive concrete evidence that the king is harboring a cure, I will retrieve it. He looked to Evie, too. For both of you. He strode back to the horses, now shuffling their hooves in agitation, and Evie felt Becky's owlish eyes seeing through her. You have someone with the illness? Becky asked. Evie straightened her skirts to give herself something to do with her hands. My father. Becky's expression was a mixture of shock and understanding. My grandmother. They both stood there, silently appraising each other. It was strange. You were really going to walk all the way to the capital? Evie asked. I got a map of their usual route from the cartography closet. I thought I'd pretend to be one of them and hitch a ride right into the Gleaming Palace. The third key. Now it made sense. Evie whistled. Terrible plan. As if you could have thought of anything better, Becky scoffed, rolling her shoulders. I never said I could. I just said your plan was terrible. Evie shrugged and smiled, self-satisfied. I can't stand you, Becky said, but there wasn't any heat to her words. Back at you. Evie rocked on her heels. They were both silent again until they heard the boss call them over to get into the carriage, to take Evie home, and to return Becky to the manor. Before either of them moved, Evie said quietly, I'm sorry about your grandmother. I'm sorry about your father, Becky said just as softly. They both began walking, still keeping a healthy silence between them. Evie broke it before they arrived at the carriage. I don't like that we have something in common. Me either, Becky shuddered. Let's never speak of it again. Agreed. Chapter 39. Evie. Where have you been? Her sister's screech filled the airy space of their home as Evie came through the door, her tiny arms wrapped around Evie's middle, shaking slightly. A pang went through Evie's chest as she knelt to wrap her arms around her sister. The villain, as requested, had dropped Evie a healthy distance from her house, Rebecca frowning in the back seat. Evie had waggled her fingers at the woman before leaping out for the second time that day and running to her home, to her family. I was trapped at work because of the storm. Didn't the raven make it here last night? Evie smoothed down the back of her sister's braid, willing her to calm. It did, but Papa couldn't get out of bed yesterday, and I couldn't get the door to latch. Lissa pulled back, wiping her nose on the back of her sleeve. It was unlocked all night, and I was afraid a bandit would come steal me and trade me for treasure. Smiling through the mental assault of imagining her little sister desperately shoving at the door, Evie brushed a tear off Lissa's face. Oh, you silly goose. A bandit would never sell you for treasure. Evie paused dramatically. They'd almost certainly trade you for something more fun, like a giant bee. As desired, the sadness disappeared from her sister's face and her eyebrows shot up one side of her mouth, quirking. Can someone own a bee? No, but I think you can rent them. Evie began laughing as soon as Lissa did. They both doubled over onto the floor, rolling onto their backs side by side. Evie reached out a hand and placed it over Lissa's smaller one. I'm sorry I wasn't here. That's okay. I know your work is important and we need food after all. Lissa, Evie laughed through a gasp. That is a terrible thing to joke about. Her little sister nodded, looking satisfied. That's why I said it. Evie laid her head back down, trying to keep the pride from her face. You are so my sister. Evie. Her father's weak voice called out from his bedroom. Is that you? She scrambled to her feet and rushed into her father's room. Griffin Sage lay pale in his bed, with a stillness that sent fear spiking underneath Evie's skin. Father? She shook his shoulder, letting out a deep sigh when she saw his chest move. The man, who looked far older than he had a day ago, smiled weakly. Evangelina, you're home safe. Shh, you need to rest. Sighing and sinking farther into his pillows, her father reached out his hand for hers. He seemed so grateful to see her, so she squeezed his hand back and added, I'm sorry, Papa. I would have tried to get home, whatever it took if I knew you were feeling ill. My sweet girl, it wasn't your fault. Her father tensed for just a moment, as though he wanted to say more, but then he relaxed again. I think you're right. I need to sleep. I'm glad you're home, Evangelina. Evie lifted his head gently to give him his medicine, then laid him back onto the pillow, brushing sticky sweat from his forehead with a damp rag. She watched him fade into sleep, the steady rise and fall of his chest, a small comfort to her guilty conscience. Creeping to the door, Evie inched back to her own bedroom, lying flat on her bed. The nearly set sun glimmered one last ray through the pane of her window, catching on something gold sitting on her desk. Rising against the ache of her muscles, she walked over to the table, and picked up the envelope with foiled lettering on the outside that read, Evangelina, I thought this would be of interest. You know who I am. Evie nearly dropped the note as her head whipped around the room, expecting whatever intruder had placed it there to be standing in a darkened corner or lurking under her bed. Lissa? What? Her sister peeked her head in the room, looking irritated. Did you put this on my desk? Evie held up the envelope, freezing when she saw that the locked door window was unlatched and there was a slight gap between the frame and the glass. No, that wasn't there when I checked your room this morning. What is it? Can I see? Lissa bounced through the doorway, and Evie felt a shaking of her nerves that wouldn't calm. Not right now, Lissa. This is for work. You can look later, Evie said kindly. Her sister rolled her eyes and shut the door. The envelope was torn before she heard the click. Her fingers ripped out the parchment, bold letters etched to the front. To Evangelina Sage, looking for a cure? Briar's Peak, tonight. Dress for a formal celebration hosted by the core healer. This invitation permits one person and one person only. Evie placed the invitation down on her desk and ran a hand through her hair, tugging at the strands. Someone had broken into her room to give her something that would help her. Help her family? It must have been the spy. Why else would they be so secretive? And for that matter, so creepy? And the core healer? Was this a myth come to life or a trap? With your luck, it's probably both. Her mind was racing, her stomach reeling and nauseous from the thought of a dangerous stranger in the same home as her family, standing so close to where she lay her head at night. Across the hall, her father groaned in pain. Damn it. Running to her bed, Evie bent and pulled a large box out from underneath it, throwing it on the bed and ripping off the lid. She gripped the fabric in angry fists, pulling it up and out with none of the satisfaction she'd had when she bought the dress. Evie had seen it in the window at a seamstress a town over and had allowed herself this one indulgence. She'd been making more than enough to support her family at that point, so there was no reason not to allow herself some luxury. And at the time, she had no idea where she'd wear it. But now was as good as time as any. The fabric appeared white, but when the light hit it, it shone every color, like a walking rainbow. It shimmered, the bodice hugging and thin sleeves draped off her shoulders in an enticing fashion. She maneuvered around, somehow managing the clasps up without falling over or breaking a wrist. After pinning her hair back with her mother's butterfly pins, she stared at herself in the mirror. She did one twirl and laughed before collecting herself into a serious expression. It wasn't every day she wore such a pretty dress. She sighed at the small pot of rouge sitting off the corner of her desk. It had been her mother's favorite lip shade. She'd given it to Evie on her last birthday before she left, but Evie hadn't been able to bring herself to touch it since then. Sucking in a deep breath, she gripped the small pot in her hands, dipped a finger into the red, and gently applied it to her lips. They stood out bright and vibrant, and Evie had the strange sense that this person in the mirror was who she was always meant to be. She smiled, but then her smile faltered, her brows knitting together as she realized this dress might be what she was buried in if she wasn't careful tonight. She sighed. At least it was sparkly. Chapter 40. Evie. Evie had no idea how or why the spy had targeted her, but if there was any hope of saving her father, surely she had to take it. After leaving Lissa tucked into her bed, ooh, under the care of their family friend, Evie tied her white cloak about her shoulders, trying not to fiddle with the butterfly pins pulling back different sections of her hair. Briar's Peak was on the other end of town, the end good people from the village tried to avoid. Despite its lovely view over Renadon, it was far too close to Hickory Forest. But since Evie had nothing to fear from the villain, she walked along the outskirts of town nearest the forest without worry, striding toward Briar's Peak. Passing a tree and standing underneath a lantern in the corner of the square, Evie rubbed her temples, careful not to smudge the makeup she'd put around her eyes. Reckless. You're reckless, Evie Sage. She sighed as she slumped against the bark, her heart racing as her gaze tried to make out any shapes in the dark. Not for the first time since setting off on this adventure tonight, she wondered if she should have contacted the villain. Truth be told, she half expected her boss to appear anyway, the way he'd done a few days ago when she was feeling deflated and a little defeated. Besides, even if she wanted to get hold of him, it's not like she could send a messenger pigeon at this hour. The office is closed before sundown. She looked down to the gold band around her smallest finger. What good is an employment bargain if you can't talk to the person who employed you? She stared hard at her finger, willing the mark to obey. Evie. The familiar voice made Evie smile. She turned to face Blade Gush again, the lantern illuminating his tan skin and the light blue satin vest for once sitting against the fabric of a shirt, a white one. She walked over to him and punched his arm lightly. Why are you lurking in the dark tonight? Evie noted the emptiness of the space around him. You didn't bring Fluffy, did you? Blade chuckled and straightened his vest. No, I did not bring Fluffy. Gods help the poor creature, although the name seems to suit him in a ridiculous, you've been hit in the head sort of way. Her favorite way. You got one of these too, huh? There was a crinkling sound as he pulled out a gold-foiled envelope, the paper, the telltale craftsmanship of merfolk-made parchment. Relief filled her that she hadn't been the only one singled out by the spy. It was never good to wish someone the same pain or discomfort you were feeling, but it was always very nice to not be alone with it. Evie adjusted one of the pins in her hair when the wind knocked a curl loose, holding out her arm. Shall we? He smiled wide before linking their arms, and they continued down the path together. Do you think anybody else received an invitation? No, because the world obviously revolves around you two. The sardonic voice was scathing and comforting in the most confusing conflict of emotions. What did I do to deserve this? Evie asked the sky as Becky stepped into the light. Her brown hair was down from her usually tight coif, gently curling just past her shoulders. A soft pink dress swirling into roses at the hem sat delicately against her light brown skin. A delicate flush of the same pink appeared at her cheeks when she saw Blade's blatant appraisal. I was about to ask you the same thing, Becky said, adjusting her glasses on her nose, another gilded envelope sitting between her fingers. I suppose you both got one of these as well. We did. Evie frowned, noticing the writing at the top of Becky's invitation. What does that say? Becky handed it to her reluctantly. To Rebecca Airing, looking for a cure? Briar's Peak, tonight. Dress for a formal celebration, hosted by the core healer. This invitation permits one person, and one person only. She handed it back to Becky, and they glanced at each other with knowing expressions before looking away. It would appear whoever left us these sought to lure us with individually compelling reasons, Blade said, studying and then holding out his invitation for both to see. Both angling their heads closer, Evie and Becky looked at the invitation Blade held. To Blade Gushiken, Briar's Peak, tonight. Dress for a formal celebration hosted by the core healer. This invitation permits one person, and one person only. That's it. Evie pulled the invitation closer, reading it over one more time to be sure. Yours doesn't have a reason the way mine and Becky's do. Why would you come at all, then? Blade shrugged, looking sheepish. It said celebration, so I thought there would be free food. Becky shook her head at him. You are a reprobate. She smoothed her invitation carefully. This is obviously a ploy to get us all to this place. I say, we go inform the boss immediately. Evie urged them both to the side of the gravel path, hidden from view of prying eyes. We're almost there. We may as well go investigate whatever this is together and then report back to the boss what we find. I don't like it, Becky grumbled uncomfortably, pulling at the sleeves of her dress. Shocking. Blade smiled, offering each woman an arm. Evie wrapped her hand around his upper arm, and Becky stomped forward beside them, refusing to meet either of their eyes. We're walking right into a very obvious trap, she grumbled, pushing the hood of her cloak up over her head. True, but at least we know they're going in, Blade said, then raised one brow at Becky. Why are you even here if you thought it could be a trap? Why didn't you take that right to the boss? Rebecca looked for a moment like a cornered animal before glancing away. Because there was a chance it wasn't, and I had to know. Evie smiled sympathetically, showing her invitation to Becky. Me too. Becky nodded stiffly. Do you think anyone else from the office received one? We're about to find out, Blade said, gesturing to the glow of light and noise coming from farther into the wooded path. It seems the festivities have already begun. It was the first time Evie had heard the word festivities as a threat. In fact, it sounded a bit like death. Chapter 41. Evie. There were lights everywhere. Briar's Peak was seated at Hickory Forest cliff ledge. There was a steep clearing on this side, far enough of a drop that there needed to be a flimsy wooden bridge connecting one side of the forest to the other. The bridge, a generous word for it, had enough planks missing that it may as well have just been two thick ropes tied together, but the rickety thing was hardly the focus. Not when the decadent opulence spread before Evie's eyes was demanding all her attention. The trees surrounding the peak were decorated in floating candles, orbed in light to keep them from incinerating the leaves and branches around them. Music and laughter sprinkled the air like confetti, and warmth brushed over Evie's bare shoulders as she removed her cloak. Blade whistled low. You clean up well, my friend. His smile was warm, unlike the daggers Becky glared at Blade before slipping off into the fray of people swaying to the sounds of the musician's chords. Evie tisked at Blade, lightly shoving him. Why didn't you say anything about the way Becky looked? Your mouth was open for a whole minute when she showed up. Blade sighed and rubbed a hand through his thick black hair. Because the things I was thinking when I saw her in that dress weren't fit for mixed company. Evie ducked away from a drunken couple stumbling past her, no doubt to do some of the illicit things Blade was talking about. That was more information than I needed, to be honest. You asked, he smiled suggestively. How rude of you to point out things that are absolutely true. Evie turned away from him, catching sight of Becky before she disappeared into the crowd once more. Well, I hope she knows what the Deadlands she's doing, because I sure don't. They passed by a long table of unfamiliar dishes, the shapes and colors of the food almost seeming from another world. Even the wine was a thick silver, unlike anything she'd ever seen. Magic has some perks, doesn't it? Blade smiled, grabbing a glass for each of them. Should we be drinking that? Evie took a whiff of the liquid, amazed that she felt intoxicated just from the fragrance. We don't know who's behind this whole thing. What if these are poison? Blade took a large gulp of his, and Evie jumped in protest. You fool! He nodded toward the rest of the crowd. Everybody's drinking them. So unless they're all being poisoned to dance in sloppily drunken circles and show blatant public displays of affection, I think we're safe. Evie took a careful sip, resisting a moan from the euphoric flavor coming from her taste buds. How can anything taste this good? She made for another large sip, but Blade stayed her hand. Careful. It's not poison, but it is strong. Now, to find the core healer. Blade searched the crowd, eyes narrowing hard. Evie looked in the direction that he was and smiled knowingly when she saw a handsome blond man kissing Becky's hand and looking very appreciatively at her figure. I'll be right back, he growled before stalking toward the two of them. But it was too late. Blade was off, nearly throwing himself between Becky and the stranger, leaning down to furiously whisper at Becky, who, in all fairness, had pure murder in her eyes as well as being interrupted. Fine, I'll do it myself, Evie muttered, examining the crowd once more for any familiar faces. There was every manner of creature here, from humans to pixies. Pure white unicorns stood tied to trees, forest sprites dancing around them. Every breath Evie took was magic, living in the air and filling her with warm happiness. She'd quietly hoped to see Tatiana among the splendor, flitting over with an invitation of her own. Evie had made light of writing out the list of employees who could be traitors for the villain, but every name she'd neatly catalogued for her boss to review had dug a pit so deep in her stomach that she could still feel it now, weeks later. Such an innocent way to rip apart the people she claimed to care for. She exhaled hard, pushing against the boning of her corseted torso. These things weren't built for people with high levels of anxiety, but at least she looked pretty. A tap on her shoulder caused her to jump and spin with her fist raised. An older man stood there, shoulder-length red hair hanging in his face. He held out a hand, dark robes covering his body. May I see your invitation, young lady? Evie narrowed her eyes in suspicion, tapping the toe of one shoe against the knife she had tucked into the sheath at her ankle to assure herself it was still there. Of course. She handed the envelope over, hoping Blade and Becky would return soon. But the older man simply smiled after reading the envelope, not bothering to pull the invitation from within, then handed it back to her without issue. Wonderful. Happy you came, dear. Do I know you? Evie asked suspiciously, trying to place the man's face. No, I wouldn't expect you to. He laughed, the sound warm and soft like liquid sugar. He held out his hand again, calloused and blistered. My name is Arthur Maehrer. I believe you work for my son, Tristan. I am the core healer. Evie was certain her body was going into shock because she froze, unable to remember how to use words to communicate, and instead kept her mouth open and her eyes glued to the man before her. You, I, um, hello? Arthur chuckled and dropped his hand back to his side when he realized hers was too heavy to move. I must say, you seem surprised to be here for someone who so insistently requested an invitation to tonight's festivities. Evie shook her head and reeled back, finding her voice. Excuse me? I I didn't request anything. This invitation was left in my bedroom with an ominous note. Arthur frowned and gestured to two wooden chairs away from the crowd. She reluctantly followed, keeping her hand out, ready to grab her dagger at a moment's notice. It wasn't as sharp as the one she'd had the day she met the villain. The one tucked away with her now was something she'd purchased at the week's end merchant market for far more than it was worth, especially considering the horrible dullness of the blade. But she digressed. It was sharp enough to stab someone. That's really all she required, should the situation call for it. I can assure you, Miss Sage, it was you who invited me to tonight's festivities. The older man held her gaze. You sent a letter this morning. Evie shook her head, battling a wave of confusion. I never sent you a letter, Mr. Maverine. I have no idea what you're talking about. Arthur stood, pulling a piece of parchment from one of the folds in his robe. Opening it while he reseated himself, he began to read. Dear Arthur Maverick, I realize you do not know me, but I know your son. I work very closely with him. Considering our connection, I would truly be so grateful if you are able to provide me an invitation to one of your illustrious celebrations. It would be of great import to not only me, but also your son, signed Evangelina Sage. When he finished reading, he looked up at her expectantly. Evie shook her head furiously. No, no, I did not send you that letter, sir. I'm not sure who did, but it was not me. Evie searched the crowd for Blade and Becky, but the two had disappeared. Arthur's face was pinched with concern. It was fatherly, and Evie almost asked him for a hug. Almost. I assure you, Evie. He tested the name out like he wanted to be sure he was getting it right. When I received this missive, I was intrigued. I felt I had no choice but to attend and seek you out. It was at this moment that she wished she had the ability to tell truth from deception. Her naivete chose the most random times to appear, and she never saw it coming until it bit her in the ass. But he looked so sincere. Do you, are you aware of, she struggled to delicately ask if Arthur knew of his son's chosen profession. Who my son is? The man folded his hands, smiling through a painful expression. Yes, I'm very aware of what life Tristan has chosen for himself. Oh, Evie said meekly. This really wasn't going the way she had planned it. She felt no closer to finding her answers. In fact, they felt further away, like she was running down a long hallway to a door she could never seem to reach. Well, that's good, I suppose. You work closely with him, Arthur asked, nothing but kind curiosity in his expression. Yes, Evie nodded. He is a wonderful boss. He cleared his throat, adjusting the buttons sitting under his chin. I'm glad he is someone who cares for him. Evie sensed he was implying a closer relationship, and she fumbled over her words to set the record straight for posterity and all. I'm his assistant, so of course I must care for his needs, his work needs, as his assistant should always do. I concur. The deep, resounding voice caused them both to jolt in their seats before she watched Arthur's eyes widen, his face going white with shock. Evie watched Arthur stand slowly, reaching out both of his hands. Tristan, he breathed. Hello, Arthur. Evie turned around and saw the villain's black-clad form. His dark eyes found hers, palpable anger there. Hello, Sage. Eyes wide in disbelief, she said, by the gods, sir, if you insist on continuing to sneak up behind me like that, I'm gonna force you to wear a bell. Honestly, this has grown a little ridiculous. But her good humor was quickly diminished by a shiver that raced down her spine as she realized the trouble she'd caused. Because of her not taking the invitation to the boss in the first place, he was now having a very public reunion with his father. A reunion she was almost certain he never intended to have. At least not now, not in front of her. As her gaze darted around the packed gathering, she began figuring out the easiest escape to run away from this disaster. What time were you sitting at?
9:36.
So, we're still good. Chapter 42. The Villain. Keep your fury calm. It was a sentence that replayed in Tristan's head so often, he figured it was branded inside his skull, a permanent part of his being. But it was difficult to be calm when so many things were spiking the pressure in his head like a tea kettle ready to screech. For one thing, his father, a man he swore to himself he'd never look in the eyes again, was staring right at him. One of his guards had informed him of a suspicious meeting among a few members of his closest circle of employees, and Tristan was out the door before Sage's name left Dante's lips. He knew it was one of Arthur's gatherings the moment he heard the music, saw the lanterns. The opulent decorations were everything he remembered them to be from his childhood, and he hated it. Not to mention the dancing until dawn while Arthur used whatever magic was in his arsenal to heal the hearts of every person who asked, which was quite a few. He thought Arthur had retired these little soirees, but a tightness in his gut told him this was far from coincidence when so many things already seemed to be going wrong in his life. This was planned. This was betrayal. The question was, by whom? The twinkling sound of Sage's chattering cleared his mind of all distraction, and he finally allowed himself to look at her. His reaction to her was startling. It wasn't like her dress was a far cry from the other bright and ostentatious colors she normally wore, but it was the way in which she wore it, like she was shining. From the pins in her hair to the black line around her eyes and her lips, they were painted red as blood. Clearing his throat, cursing himself for losing some of his composure, Tristan pulled his back straight, willing himself to hide whatever thoughts were running through his mind about his assistant. Agony. This is agony. Sir! Sage waved a hand in front of his face. The firelight caught against the jeweled butterflies in her hair, making the dark strands look edged in starlight. Arthur, would you excuse us? My assistant and I need to have a conversation, he said, unable to keep the thin edge of anger from his tone. He watched Sage's delicate neck tighten as she swallowed her breath. No, no, Arthur began, but Tristan didn't have time. He could tell by the wideness of his assistant's eyes that her imagination at what the villain might do when he fired her for this recklessness was running wild. I'm sure your guests would like your attention." He waved at the people hovering around them, desperation lighting their eyes. Arthur stood slowly, the familiar lines of his face causing his chest to tighten. "Promise you'll sit down with me before you leave, Tristan." The hand his father placed on his shoulder nearly made him growl, but he bit back any response and just nodded stiffly. As soon as he was out of earshot, the villain whipped around to Evie, only to find her slowly creeping in the other direction. "Where do you think you're going?" "Oh, I was just gonna." And to his surprise, she turned hard and sprinted through the crowd. "Get back here, Sage!" Tristan hollered, feeling ridiculous as he chased after her like a fox on a hunt. He bumped into a couple wrapped in a passionate embrace and rolled his eyes at their protest of outrage. "Evangelina!" He dove for her hand, but she slipped out of his grasp and ran onto the rickety bridge farther into the darkness. She couldn't make this easy for him. Of course she would run. Tristan used to like when people responded to him that way, once upon a time. But right now, he hated it. He followed close behind, determined, despite the heavy feeling in his heart that he must have frightened her. He wanted to kick his own ass at how he'd handled seeing her there, so close to his father. Fear was not an emotion Tristan was used to feeling, and clearly, Sage was determined to make him suffer it often. The bridge groaned and wobbled underneath his weight, and the darkness that lay beyond threatened to swallow him. But the moon once more caught on the gems in Sage's hair. Tristan kept his gaze there, knowing he'd follow that light wherever it went. He'd never been this sentimental, and it was all her fault. When he reached the other side of the bridge, the trees whipped in the cool night air, and without the fire to warm it, the air was frigid. She was probably cold. "Sage, come out! You're going to catch your death, and then I will have to hire Rebecca in your stead." She stumbled from the bushes, twigs sticking from her hair. "That was evil," she glared. He looked at her sardonically, raising a brow. "That's kind of the point." She walked closer to him, nervously pulling a curl between her fingers. "All right, go ahead. Yell at me." "Oh, am I supposed to yell?" "I know you're angry because of something to do with Arthur," she started. "I'm not angry," he interrupted, pushing a drop of sweat from his forehead. When she just cocked one brow at him in challenge, he admitted, "Yes, I am very angry, but not because of Arthur right now." Her eyes widened. "Oh, so you are angry with me that I didn't come to you before I went to this gathering thing. But I swear I didn't know it was going to be hosted by your father and that I would upset you." She said the last word on a wince, and he had to swallow a laugh, a problem he didn't seem to have until recently. "I'm not upset, Sage," he said, gathering his thoughts along with his racing pulse. She gave him a scrutinizing look and motioned to the grip that his other hand had on the hilt of his sword. He released it immediately, feeling slightly sheepish, perhaps for the first time in his life. "It's a habit," he grumbled. "Right," she nodded, exaggerating a pout, as she walked around him to sit on the cliff's edge. The glow of the fire lit the planes of her cheekbones, even from a distance. "I'm not angry with you," he said, awkwardly bending to sit beside her. "I was notified by my guards that my employees were here. I knew it wasn't a coincidence, but there was never a moment where I thought not to trust you." The villain wasn't sure why it was so important that she know this, but it was. She seemed to believe him. peeking down at the golden band around her pinky finger. He looked away, feeling guilty. I'm glad you trust me, she said flatly. Oh, yes, you sound it, he replied, sarcasm dripping from his words. Tristan looked to the candles decorating the trees around them, glowing perhaps brighter than when they'd first arrived on the other side of the bridge. The music floating gently set a lovely scene. The villain didn't know what contentment felt like. He'd spent so long living uncomfortably in the world that he'd begun to rely on that emotion, never allowing himself to settle. But in this moment, he thought perhaps he could, quite easily. I'll say this for my father, his parties always have good music. Sage's gaze turned to his, and his face was close enough that he could see the candle's reflection in her eyes. Does he do things like this a lot? I don't know, Tristan sighed, pressing his middle and pointer finger against the bridge of his nose. I haven't talked to him in years. In all fairness, Tristan had spent most of his life not talking to Arthur. It wasn't just that Arthur had spent most of Tristan's childhood traveling to different places, using the core healer abilities where he was needed. Tristan's mother, Amara, had told Tristan and his siblings that it was selfish for them to keep Arthur with them when there were so many who needed his help. It was comical to Tristan now how that need never seemed to matter if it was coming from Arthur's children. By the time Claire was born, Arthur had begun to slow down, spending more time at home in their seaside village. Tristan was older, so most of Arthur's attention was spent on Tristan's younger siblings. Amara Mavrine was not a cold woman, but she was not an affectionate one either. She did not see the sense in hugs or comfort when the world was so much harsher than that. It was something that Tristan was grateful for. It saved him from the feelings of rejection. Arthur had taken a softer approach with Claire and Malcolm upon his return, but he must have assumed it was too late for Tristan. At the beginning, it had stung when Tristan would try and bond with Arthur, only to be met with disinterest. But Tristan slid back into the patterns he had been raised with quickly, almost to preserve himself. He didn't need affection. He didn't need people to show they loved him. It was a waste of time. It was wasted on him. In the end, it hadn't mattered anyway. By the time Arthur made tentative steps to build a relationship with Tristan, it was too late. But that hadn't stopped Arthur from trying, over the years, to send letters, to attempt meetings. Tristan had ignored every single one. At least his siblings' hope of redemption for him had finally died, and they were far more tolerable to be around. His mother's hopes, he knew, had died too, but that was a whole other brand of torture to subject himself to later, perhaps. No, right now he would allow himself this small sliver of happiness, if that's what the warmth creeping through his chest felt like. In fact, he'd wring this moment of every ounce of joy he could. Quickly standing, Tristan watched Sage's face turn up towards his eyebrows raised in confusion. What are you doing? Her eyes widened when she saw him reach out a hand for hers. Would you like to dance? Her eyes widened even more, but a small smile graced the red bow of her lips. With whom? She looked around dramatically. Tristan smirked because, in all truth, she was very funny. With me. Sage gripped his hand and let him pull her to her feet. When he bent his neck to take her in, he was knocked breathless by her joy aimed at him full force. It was so foreign to have someone so happy in his presence, or even because of his presence, that he almost missed a step. I'm not really certain how to dance with another person. She scrunched her nose and stared at their clasped hands. Usually, I just spin in circles until I get dizzy. Well, he'd miscalculated. The music, which had been a lively and sprightly tune, had sobered into something slower, more intimate. He tortured many men over his 10 years in his business for information, for making them angry, for trying to kill him. And he'd been loath to admit it. But he even did it once because he'd seen a man being cruel to a duck. It had been a bonus to find out the man was a retired Valiant Guard, but that was neither here nor there. This was a different sort of torture, one he'd never experienced before. He'd become so good at not wanting anything above what he could take. But this woman was not a possession. She was a person he greatly admired and respected, someone he relied on more than he'd ever thought possible, someone to whom he would never admit any of this. You get this one happy moment, he reminded himself. Without hesitating, Tristan placed his other hand on the small of her back, guiding her into his embrace. Her breath hitched, and Tristan could feel the warmth from her skin through the silken fabric of her dress. Clearing his throat, he brought their clasped hands up and began gliding them in slow steps. So, you dance? Sage asked, her face tilting up to his. It was closer than he thought, and when he looked down, he saw why. She was dancing on the tips of her toes. I learned years ago when I worked for. He cut off, not because he didn't want to finish his sentence, but because just then Tristan caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd across the bridge. What is my sister doing here? The villain asked in confusion. Claire's here? Sage whipped her head to where he looked, but neither of them stopped swaying or staying linked together. The wheels of her brain were turning a mile a minute. He could tell by the look in her eyes. You don't think the traitor could be... He interrupted before she could get the thought out. I've had my guards tailing both of my siblings since the bomb incident. They have both been accounted for at the traitor's every turn. They hate me, certainly, but it is not either of them trying to take me down. I don't think they hate you, Evie said quietly as he moved them into a gentle spin. You can't know that. Tristan wouldn't look at her. Instead, he found one of the lights behind them and kept his gaze glued there. But I do. She pressed the tip of one shoe onto his until he looked at her. I know that love between siblings. They have it for you. It's quite obvious. It's not like what you have with Lissa, he said, sweeping her out into another spin. She laughed deeply before spinning back into his arms. Our relationship's a little different, yes, but the fundamentals are the same. I used to endlessly annoy my brother when we were children, often on purpose. But at the end of the day, we do anything for one another. I didn't realize you had a brother, Tristan said softly, acutely aware that Sage was the sole provider of her family. He died. There was a lifelessness to Sage's voice that startled him. That must have been very difficult for you. Their dancing had slowed, but they were still moving, still spinning. It was more the abruptness of it. She remained looking at him, but her eyes were blank. It was an accident with my mother's magic. Life never stopped changing after that. Gideon was gone, then my mother. I left school to take care of Lissa, and then had to stop my schooling to begin working after my father fell ill. I feel like my life keeps happening to me rather than me living it. It was a sad story. Tristan had heard many of those. That wasn't what affected him. It was the way she delivered the words, looking right at him, her gaze open and honest as she laid her weaknesses bare, like they were worthy of every part of his attention. She had it, all of it. I felt like that too. He paused. Like life is just happening to me. Many times. At the declaration, a startled look came over her face, which nearly made him stop, but he didn't. I wasn't prepared to see my father this evening. That was my fault. I'm so sorry. But she stopped when he gave her a mock glare. He wanted to rip that godforsaken word from her vocabulary. It's difficult for me to be around him. It reminds me of my childhood. He wasn't there very often. Being a core healer required travel, a lot of it. There was always someone who needed him more, and it made me feel unimportant. That was all he could give for now. But it was enough, by the way Sage gazed at him with a kinship that he hadn't known he was waiting for. I understand, she said, smiling lightly because she did understand. He could see that now. Life is sometimes just exhausting. A bit overcome still, he remained silent. Sage's eyes went wide when he didn't speak, and her cheeks were tinged red. Not that working for you is exhausting. It's more like taking years off your life, he supplied helpfully. I wasn't going to say that, she frowned at him. Out loud. A rusty laugh escaped the back of his throat. If the work isn't tiring enough, I could have you join Scatterday with the interns. He widened his steps and swooped her into a long spin. That's the one chasing? She asked, something scary in her expression. I'm not that evil. He arched a brow and froze when he saw a gleam in her eye. Why are you smiling right now, Sage? I was just thinking that we are worthy of a stage performance. As if anyone would ever want to watch you and me argue, the villain scoffed. I don't know, Evie said with a twinkle in her eye. He shook his head, spinning them around in one more sweep. It was a nearly perfect moment. And then the screaming began. And that is it for today, I think. What time is it?
9:58.
Right on time. I fucking timed that so perfectly. Where's my bookmark? So, screaming. That's what you get left with. Screaming and then silence. Where's the bookmark?
It's at the end of your banky.
Thought that was forgiveness.
Well,
What?
now, wait.
That's what
We still got
forgiveness
2
sounds like.
left on the clock.
What?
We still got 2 minutes left on the clock.
No, I don't think we can get through this chapter in 2 minutes.
No.
There's no way. There's no
We
way.
can get an extra fact.
No.
Fact.
No, it's cliffhanger town now. That's what you get. That's how it rolled out. Look. We maybe could have gotten farther if you didn't let me and Dad riff for so long. That's what Dad
Especially
told me.
about Wyoming.
Oh,
Especially about Wyoming. We talked a lot of shit about Wyoming.
And how you know more about Nepal than Wyoming.
I do. It's more in the news.
We don't want to use Colorado, and here's the
You
reason
care.
why.
No, we're
You
absolutely
thought
not using
Wyoming, and my
Colorado.
brain
No,
went to
here's my reasons
Wisconsin
why.
because that's what I always hear people talk about.
The Nazis 100% don't deserve
Absolutely.
anything beautiful in Colorado.
No.
And definitely don't deserve the only place in the contiguous United States where you can have a sky burial.
open air funeral.
Yeah.
They don't do sky burials in the U.S.
I'm sorry, a sky, and yes, the funeral pyre.
Sorry, I had to correct you because there is a sky burial. We don't do that here. I don't want anybody getting excited.
No,
we don't
that's
do
my
this
plan
here.
for Nepal.
Also,
Damn.
we're almost not going to be able to do
Damn.
sky burial anyway because the vulture population.
Dying out? Well, looks like we need to fix that real quick.
Yeah, that's what I said when I found out.
I will
Breeding
offer my
initiative.
body to
Let's
the
go.
vultures.
What?
I see what you did there. Thank you for that.
What? What did you? What? Who said what now?
We were offering sacrifices for the vultures.
Yeah.
Man, we got to get this vulture population in the ups. That's just not going to work for me. I know the likelihood of being allowed a sky burial is slim to none, but I would like for it to exist. It's fun that it exists.
Is that
Wait.
the one where they like